Thank you very much, Maria Rosa, and thank you for the Internet Forum for inviting me to this event, and for Miapetra for sponsoring this event. I think it's a very important subject, and the global digital economy needs to take place. And the idea of moving into this negotiation is to improve international governance of digital services. Thank you very much to Christophe as well, as chief negotiator. Thank you for the state of play. I mean, of course, the European Services Forum is working closely with you and the Intercommittee on this issue from the very beginning. For those who maybe do not know well the European Services Forum, we are an organization representing the interest of all services sectors interested into international trade and investment negotiations. And we have developed already 2 years ago a position paper for this negotiation on WTO on the so-called joint statement initiative on e-commerce. To respond also to the question, we certainly prefer to have digital trade, which is much more encompassing the whole digital economy. Sometimes e-commerce can have a connotation of only a limited part of the digital economy, and people might think that it is more about B2C, so business to consumer, which of course the rules for an international agreement will cover the whole digital economy. 71 countries, as Christophe mentioned, have started these negotiations. Now there is 86, so I think we are above 80% of global trade, which would be covered if all of these countries would sign an agreement. Interesting maybe to note which countries have not signed up, which is India and South Africa as a bigger country, part of, I would say, G20, but also a long list of African countries and LDCs have not yet part of it. 6 African countries are now part of it, but still 48 or more countries are not in. If we would like, as this is certainly our wish to use this agreement to diminish the digital divide, we will of course have to bring more countries on board in due time. The EU has already some e-commerce or digital chapter in its own FTAs, and I think that is important to say. We have signed with Canada, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, Mexico, and recently with the United Kingdom. We are still negotiating, or Christophe is negotiating with Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and others. So we have now a good basis to go forward, and the EU has put forward its proposal that it is using in its own bilaterals into the WTO. Let me run through explaining what we believe the business is willing to have in these negotiations by going through 6 main elements that we consider as very important into looking at these negotiations. The first one, I think I will label it a facilitate trade and build digital trust, which means that it is, as Christophe mentioned, and some texts are already nearly finalized on this issue, e-authentication, e-signature, fight against spam, I think are already finished. Now there is still work moving on with the negotiators to find disciplines on mutual recognition of digital entities, to be sure that everybody understand and recognize what is legally possible. E-invoicing, the consumer protection, paperless trading, the express shipment for e-commerce, the facilitation of e-payment, also looking at open government data, cybersecurity. All of these needs to be taken on board, and if that would be a core text of already these new disciplines, that would be a very good basis for a new agreement on WTO rules on e-commerce. Now, the second aspect that I'm looking at is we would like these negotiations to improve commitments in regulatory disciplines. I mean, disciplines related to digital services. And I'm thinking here about what Christophe reminded us about the reference paper on basic telecom, which is now nearly 25 years old. The regulatory environment in everything related to digital, not only telecom, has now very much involved. And I think it would be very important to review this proposal and to include not only basic telecom, but everything related to digital trade in this new reference paper. But unfortunately, only the EU and last month, EU, Norway, Ukraine and the UK have tabled a proposal for a new reference paper, but we look forward to see other countries joining on and pushing for something like that. Linked to this is also if we have good disciplines, but the disciplines would apply only to the existing commitments taken by the countries, which are 25 years old, this would not be sufficient. So we hope that during these talks, some countries would accept to take new market access negotiations onwards and take new commitments into, let's say, e-commerce or computer-related services, everything linked to digital trade. My third aspect is something which is also very important. It's looking for no custom duties on electronic transactions. Here, as Christophe explained, we have the WTO e-commerce program since 1998, which is ongoing. That is into the WTO ambit. The GSI is not encompassing all WTO members. We hope that it will be possible with all the signatory to have a permanent ban on the custom duties on electronic transactions. But unfortunately, as you may know, India and South Africa and Namibia are now saying that this moratorium should be ended. So we will see what will happen at the next ministerial, but at least in the GSI, that those signing countries should commit to a permanent ban. The fourth issue, also important, is what I will label the protection of the intellectual property rights. I'm thinking here about the discipline should store a ban that any government should not be allowed to ask for a requirement to get access to software source code and to algorithm. These are really important, and if we want to continue to spare an innovation in digital economy, these rights need really to be protected. The fifth aspect is no discrimination against digital product. That is something that the members of the TPP, what I'm calling the TPP 12, which is a comprehensive partnership Trans-Pacific agreement, is plus the United States. These countries are pushing for labeled of an article for non-discrimination against digital product. And here in the European Union, we have a problem with this because of the fact that in Europe, we consider we cannot be digital and product at the same time. Either you're digital and it's a service, or you're a product and it is a physical good. And that is a long history behind this. I'm not going to go into the details, but the idea of the EU wanted here is to protect cultural diversity. But if we look at what has these countries adopted in these non-discrimination against digital product, they actually allow for exception for broadcasting, and they allow for subsidies to have cultural diversity production. And that is clear in the US, which has a very strong protection of their broadcast services. And in the USMCA, Quebec has been allowed to continue to subsidize French-speaking production. So it seems that a compromise should be feasible, provided that we don't go into a too much dogmatic position, and then we might have difficulties. The last one, the last issue is probably the most important one. And I'm glad to hear Christophe saying that next week they're going to start or initiate discussion on this issue. This is about cross-border data flow. This is where we will see whether the WTO is able to negotiate. The first issue I mentioned are very important, but let's say they are expected to be accepted by most of the countries because they are already enshrined in most of the domestic regulation. If we want the WTO to be really moving into dynamic, modern negotiating function for new agreement for the future, this agreement will need to tackle cross-border data flow issues. Let me say here that essentially what we're looking at is banning localization requirement and making the data to move as freely as possible. Here we have three camps. One is what I will call those who want to control data. Those who want, for political reason, for sovereignty reason, for protectionist reason, they want to be able to control the data in their own territory, and that will be contrary to the free flow of data. So I'm thinking here about China, Russia, Vietnam, Indonesia maybe. So these countries want to be able to control. India in a bit also cover in this one. So that would be probably complicated for these countries to take a data flow, cross-border data flow commitment. And then we have two other camps. One is the EU, and what I will say is a satellite of the EU. And the other one would be the US and the CPTPP members. These countries, these two bloccs, I think, agree on the principle that they are willing to have a ban on localization requirement. But the EU is saying we have nevertheless to be able to have very strict regulation on allowing to protect data flow, to protect personal data, sorry. So the famous GDPR. And the US countries and the like would put first the principle of free flow of data, accepting eventually few exceptions. The problem in the EU is that now we have considered that data protection, personal data protection, is a fundamental human right, and a fundamental human right, it is not possible to have any conditionality to protect the human rights, and therefore the language used in a TPP is saying yes, you can have protection of data because it is a legitimate public policy objective, but then there is a conditionality which is as long that there is no unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restriction on trade, and this is where we will need to find a compromise. Now, I don't know whether some of you are following what's happening in the Parliament today, but there is a link, and that is in the Labour Committee. They have decided that the EU-UK adequacy decision is not good enough to protect data. The UK, being a country leaving the EU and have legislation on data protection which is equivalent to GDPR, it is sending a very wrong signal that actually the European Union will be able or will not be able to actually accept data coming from elsewhere and not allowing the data of European citizens going to be sent outside the EU. That is really, I think, a problem. If the EU is toughening very much and not willing at all to move at making any possibility of compromise into this text, I guess it's going to be very complicated. I'm going to stop here just to say that, of course, as a conclusion, we hope very much that by the end of this year, in the 12th Ministerial Conference of WTO, we will have a strong recommendation by the ministers to continue to negotiate, and that Christophe and his colleagues would have been able to have a streamlined text of this consolidated text. So maybe to open up the debate, because we have three camps, if we want to be able to move on, maybe at a point in time, if we want to be able to have an agreement, even if it is not covering all WTO members, we might think about going of a two-tier approach to have different level of commitment, but at least that's something we'll move on. But that is just to open up the debate. Thank you very much.